My name's James, but most people call me Jim. I've been married for almost 10 years to my wife, Emily. We live in this quiet suburb called Maple Ridge, just outside of Chicago. It's the kind of place where everyone waves at you as they walk their dogs. And the biggest event of the week is the Sunday farmers market. I thought our life here was perfect. I really did. Emily and I met in college back at Northwestern. She was this fiery redhead who lit up the room whenever she walked in. Smart, funny, driven. She had it all. We dated for about 2 years before I proposed. I was sure she was the one. After graduation, we both got good jobs. I went into marketing at a firm downtown, and she worked as a graphic designer. Things were steady, comfortable even, but I never expected comfortable to turn into this. About 6 months ago, things started to feel different. Emily became distant, but not in a way that screamed affair right off the bat. At first, it was subtle. She'd cancel plans we had with friends because of work deadlines. Or she'd seem exhausted even though she was working the same hours she always had. I chalked it up to burnout. After all, we were both working long hours, and the stress of city life can get to anyone, right? But then there were the nights she didn't come home until late. Too late. She'd tell me she was grabbing drinks with coworkers, or that there was an urgent project. She'd say it with a smile, that same smile I'd fallen for. So I didn't think too much about it. I trusted her. Trust. That's the word that keeps gnawing at me now. It's such a fragile thing, isn't it? I had no idea mine was about to be shattered. I started noticing more signs, small things at first. Her phone was always glued to her hand, and she'd laugh at texts. But when I asked what was so funny, she'd brush it off with some vague answer. She was also more protective of her phone than she'd ever been. I didn't want to be that guy snooping around or questioning her all the time. But you know how sometimes your gut just knows before your brain does? Yeah, that feeling crept in slowly but surely. The real turning point came about a month ago. I remember it clearly because it was a Wednesday night. Emily was supposed to be working late again, and I was sitting on the couch watching the Cubs game. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my buddy Mike. "Hey man, I just saw Emily downtown, but she wasn't at work. Thought you might want to know." My heart sank, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I texted him back, asking where he saw her. He told me he spotted her at this bar called O'Malley's, which is nowhere near her office. My stomach churned, but I convinced myself it was probably innocent. Maybe she'd had a spontaneous drink with a friend or something. But something didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling. When Emily got home that night, she acted like everything was normal. I asked her about her day, and she went into her usual busy with work routine. I didn't mention Mike seeing her. I wanted to see if she'd bring it up. She didn't. That's when I knew something was off. A few days later, I decided to dig a little deeper. Not in a crazy, paranoid way, just enough to get some peace of mind. I figured I'd check her phone when she was in the shower or asleep. But Emily had always been careful with her phone lately, so I wasn't sure if I'd even get a chance. Then, as if fate decided to give me a nudge, Emily left her phone on the kitchen counter one Saturday morning while she went for a run. It was the perfect opportunity. I didn't feel good about it, but my curiosity was eating me alive at this point. When I picked up her phone, my hands were shaking. I hesitated for a second, feeling like I was about to cross some line I couldn't uncross. But I did it anyway. Her phone wasn't locked, so I went straight to her messages. That's when I found them. Texts. Hundreds of them. But not with a coworker, not with a friend, but with some guy named Tyler. I didn't know any Tyler. These weren't just casual texts either. They were flirtatious, intimate. Things you'd never say to someone unless you were doing what I feared she was doing. My head was spinning. I scrolled through message after message, feeling more nauseous with each one. Tyler was apparently someone she met at a work event months ago, and their relationship had escalated from there. They weren't just texting either. There were pictures, plans to meet up, and references to places I knew she'd been on those nights she worked late. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This couldn't be real. This wasn't the Emily I knew. But there it was, all laid out in front of me. She was cheating on me. There was no other way to describe it. I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing. What do you even do in that moment? How do you process something like that? The woman I had spent the last decade of my life with, the one I trusted with everything, was betraying me with some guy I didn't even know existed until 5 minutes ago. I wanted to confront her, to yell, to scream, to ask her why. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the messages, my heart breaking with each one. When Emily came back from her run, she was her usual self, smiling, energetic, acting like nothing was wrong. I couldn't even look at her. I made up some excuse about needing to go into work, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I needed space. I needed to think. That drive was the longest one of my life. My mind was spinning in a million directions. Should I confront her? Should I leave? What about our house, our life, everything we'd built? It was like everything I thought I knew had been flipped upside down. I pulled into a random parking lot and just sat there. It wasn't until hours later that I realized I hadn't moved, hadn't done anything but stare out the windshield, trying to piece together what my next step should be. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing between anger, disbelief, and sadness. How had things gotten to this point? I kept asking myself that over and over, like somehow there'd be an answer that would make sense of all of this. But there wasn't. There was no justification for what she'd done. Eventually, I knew I had to face reality. I couldn't stay out there forever, and I couldn't ignore what I'd found. I went home, but the second I stepped through the door, everything felt different. The place we'd built together, the cozy home we'd spent years making our own, suddenly felt cold, empty. I couldn't even look at Emily the same way anymore. Every time she smiled, every time she asked me how my day was, it felt fake, like a bad act. The worst part was that I didn't confront her right away. I know, it sounds weak, but part of me just couldn't handle the confrontation. I wasn't ready. Instead, I started to distance myself, keeping everything bottled up inside while trying to figure out my next move. It's crazy, the lengths your mind goes to when you're trying to protect yourself from the truth. I told myself I needed more evidence, more proof, even though I had already seen enough to confirm everything. I started paying closer attention to her routine, looking for any slip-up. If she was texting more than usual, I noticed. If she mentioned Tyler in passing, I caught it. It was like I had turned into this paranoid detective in my own marriage. But I couldn't stop myself. I just had to know everything. A week later, the opportunity came. Emily had gone out again, supposedly for a work dinner. But this time I wasn't going to just sit at home waiting. I decided to follow her. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't shake the idea that I needed to see it with my own eyes. So, I got in my car and drove to the restaurant she said she'd be at. When I got there, I parked across the street and waited. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, I saw her walk out of the building. But she wasn't alone. Tyler was there. I knew it was him the second I saw them together. He fit the description from the pictures I'd seen on her phone. They weren't even trying to hide it. They stood there on the sidewalk, laughing and touching each other in ways that made my stomach turn. I felt like I was going to throw up. I snapped a couple of pictures from my car, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe for proof, maybe for closure, I don't know. But seeing them together made everything real in a way that the texts and pictures hadn't. This wasn't just some fantasy playing out in secret. It was happening, right in front of me. My wife was in a full-blown affair, and I had been too blind or too trusting to see it. I wanted to jump out of the car and confront them right then and there, but something held me back. Instead, I drove home again, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought they might break. I knew what I had to do now. There was no avoiding it anymore. That night, when Emily got home, I was waiting for her in the living room. She was her usual chipper self, acting like everything was normal. But this time, I didn't let her get away with it. "Emily," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "We need to talk." She froze for a second, like she hadn't expected me to say that. I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, and that's when I knew. She knew. She had to have felt it coming, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it to herself. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light, but there was a nervous edge to it. "I know about Tyler," I said, cutting straight to the point. Her face went pale. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out how to respond. But what do you say when you've been caught in something like this? There's no easy way out. Jim, she started, but I wasn't in the mood to hear excuses. Don't, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't lie to me. I saw the texts. I saw the pictures. And tonight, I saw the two of you together. The room fell silent. Emily stood there, her mouth slightly open, like she couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. I half expected her to deny everything, to try and gaslight me into thinking I was wrong. But she didn't. Instead, she just sat down on the couch, her face crumpling into something I hadn't seen from her in a long time, guilt. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Sorry? That was it? Sorry was supposed to make this all better? I could feel the anger boiling up inside me. How could she be sorry when she'd been doing this behind my back for months? She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. Is that all you have to say? I asked, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. Emily wiped her eyes, looking at me with this broken expression that only made me angrier. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It just did. You didn't mean for it to happen? I snapped. Emily, you've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around, sleeping with some other guy while I'm sitting at home like an idiot. You don't accidentally have an affair. I know, she cried, her voice cracking. I know, Jim. I messed up. Okay? I messed up, and I don't know how to fix it. Fix it. As if there was some magical way to put everything back together like nothing had happened. As if she could just hit undo, and we'd go back to the way things were before. But there was no going back. Not after this. I stood there, staring at her, the woman I thought I knew. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. But now all I saw was a stranger. A stranger who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, I said quietly, the weight of those words sinking into the air between us. Emily didn't say anything. She just sat there, crying silently, as if she already knew she'd destroyed everything. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there alone. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew one thing for sure. Our life, our marriage, would never be the same again. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. It felt like I was living in a fog, just going through the motions without really feeling anything. I stayed in the house, but barely spoke to Emily. She didn't try to talk to me either, and honestly, I was grateful for that. I needed space to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Every morning, I'd get up, go to work, and pretend like nothing was wrong. My colleagues didn't notice anything different. They had no idea that my marriage was falling apart right in front of me. It's strange how easy it is to hide something so huge. I guess I wasn't ready for the world to know. I wasn't even ready to admit it to myself. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my friends, not my family. It felt too personal, too raw. And if I'm being honest, I was ashamed. Ashamed that I hadn't seen the signs sooner. Ashamed that my wife had been cheating on me. And ashamed that I didn't know what to do about it. I kept thinking about what everyone would say. People would ask me questions I didn't have the answers to, and I wasn't sure I could handle that. But eventually, I cracked. I needed to talk to someone to get all of this off my chest. So one night after work, I called my best friend, Greg. We'd been friends since high school, and he was one of the few people I trusted completely. If anyone would understand, it was him. I met Greg at a bar downtown. It was one of those places we used to go to when we were younger, back when life was simpler and things weren't so damn complicated. We grabbed a couple of beers and sat at a corner booth, where it was quiet enough to talk. Greg could tell something was up the second I walked in. He always had that ability, reading me before I even said a word. He raised an eyebrow as I slid into the booth across from him. "You look like hell, man," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "What's going on?" I didn't waste time with small talk. I told him everything. About the texts, the pictures, following Emily, seeing her with Tyler. I even told him about the confrontation that night, how she had admitted everything. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of relief, like saying the words out loud made the whole situation more real but somehow lighter at the same time. When I finished, Greg leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slowly. "Damn, Jim, I don't even know what to say." "Yeah, well, join the club," I muttered, taking a long drink from my beer. "I don't know what to do, man. I don't know if I can get past this." Greg was quiet for a moment, staring down at the table. Then he looked up at me, his expression serious. "Look, man, I'm not going to pretend to know what you're feeling, but what she did, that's not something you can just sweep under the rug. You deserve better than that." I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I believed it. I knew Greg was right, but the idea of ending my marriage felt so final, so overwhelming. There was a part of me that wanted to believe things could go back to the way they were, that somehow we could fix this. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. "It's just, I don't know how to walk away," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've been together for so long. She was my whole life, you know?" "I get that," Greg said. "But ask yourself this. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life with someone you can't trust?" That question hit me like a punch to the gut. Trust. It was the foundation of everything. And once it was broken, could it ever truly be rebuilt? I didn't have an answer to that, but the doubt lingered in my mind long after I left the bar that night. When I got home, Emily was already in bed. We'd been sleeping in separate rooms since the night I confronted her, and that arrangement suited me just fine. I couldn't stand the thought of being close to her right now. The thought of her lying in the same bed we'd shared for years, knowing she'd been with someone else. It was too much. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the closed door to our bedroom. Part of me wanted to open it, to sit down and talk to her, to figure out if there was any way to salvage what we had left. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I went to the guest room, where I'd been sleeping for the past week. The bed was smaller and uncomfortable, but it was mine, for now. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing with thoughts of what my life was going to look like from here on out. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in limbo, pretending like I didn't know what was happening. I had to face this head-on, even if it meant my marriage was over. I sat down with Emily that evening. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or something else, but either way, it didn't change what I needed to say. "Emily, we need to talk about what happens next," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, as if she already knew where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I can't keep doing this," I replied. "I can't keep pretending like things can just go back to the way they were. You broke my trust, and I don't know if I can ever get that back." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to do this. For me. For my own sanity. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying we need to take a break," I said, the words coming out slowly, deliberately. "I need space to figure out what I want, what we want. Maybe this marriage can be saved, but I don't know if I'm ready for that right now." Emily didn't say anything. She just nodded, wiping away the tears that had started streaming down her face. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it down. I had to do what was right for me, even if it hurt her. We agreed that she would stay with her sister for a while, to give us both time to think. The next morning, she packed a bag and left. I watched her go, standing in the doorway as she walked down the driveway and got into her car. She didn't look back. As soon as she was gone, the silence in the house was deafening. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. And as much as I thought I wanted that, the reality of it hit me harder than I expected. I stood in the empty house, my mind swirling with everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. The next few days were strange. The house felt too quiet without Emily there. I found myself wandering from room to room, unsure of what to do with myself. Part of me felt relieved that she was gone, that I had some space to breathe and think. But another part of me felt empty, like a piece of my life had been ripped away, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. I spent a lot of time thinking about what Greg had said, about trust and whether or not it was something that could ever be rebuilt after something like this. I wasn't sure. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to look at Emily the same way again. Every time I thought about her, I pictured her with Tyler, and it made my stomach churn. But despite everything, I still loved her. That was the hardest part. No matter how much she'd hurt me, no matter how much she'd betrayed me, I couldn't just turn off my feelings. And that made the decision even harder. In the end, I knew I had to take things one day at a time. Maybe we could rebuild, maybe we couldn't. But for now, I needed to focus on myself, to figure out who I was without her and what I wanted my future to look like. For the first time in years, my life was a blank slate. And as terrifying as that was, it was also a strange kind of freedom. The first few weeks after Emily left were both disorienting and strangely liberating. I found myself caught between waves of relief and crushing loneliness. There was no more pretending, no more forced conversations or shared space that felt like a battleground. But with that came the realization that everything I'd built my life around for the past decade was now in shambles. I spent a lot of time avoiding the house. Being there, in the silence, only made me think of what had happened. The memories felt oppressive, like every corner of every room had witnessed the lies and deceit that had poisoned our relationship. So, I took up running again, something I hadn't done since my college days. It gave me an outlet, a way to burn off the anger and frustration that seemed to bubble beneath the surface, even when I thought I was keeping it together. Every morning, I'd lace up my old running shoes and head out before sunrise, the cool air biting at my skin as I pounded the pavement through the quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood. It became my ritual, my way of starting each day with a clear head, even if my heart was still a mess. Work became my other escape. I threw myself into projects with a single-minded focus, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra assignments just to keep myself busy. It was easier to think about deadlines and spreadsheets than to deal with the mess my personal life had become. My coworkers probably thought I was just being ambitious, but the truth was, I was running from my own thoughts. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, there were always moments when reality hit hard. Nights were the worst. After a long day, when I was too exhausted to keep up the charade, I'd come home to an empty house, and the weight of everything would settle in. The bed still felt too big without Emily next to me, even if I hadn't wanted her there in those final weeks. I'd lie awake for hours, replaying everything in my mind, what I should have said, what I could have done differently. It was like I was stuck in a loop, unable to move forward. After a month of living like this, I finally broke down and called my mom. I'd been avoiding the conversation, knowing it would be painful to admit to my family that my marriage was falling apart. My parents loved Emily. Hell, my whole family did. They'd always seen us as this picture-perfect couple, the kind of relationship everyone aspired to have. Little did they know what had been happening behind closed doors. I told my mom everything, in as much detail as I could manage without breaking down completely. I expected her to be shocked, maybe even angry, but instead, she was calm, supportive in that quiet, steady way that only a mother can be. "Jim, I'm so sorry you're going through this," she said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "But you don't have to make any decisions right now. Take your time. Figure out what you need." Her words were a small comfort, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I still didn't know what I needed, or even what I wanted. Part of me wanted to move on, to leave Emily behind and start fresh. But another part of me, the part that had spent years building a life with her, wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. A week later, I got a text from Emily. She hadn't reached out since she left, and seeing her name on my phone sent a jolt through me. "Emily, can we talk? I've been thinking about everything, and I really want to see if we can work this out." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. The rational part of me knew I wasn't ready to talk yet, that I still needed more time. But another part of me, the part that hated this limbo we were in, wanted to hear her out. I wanted to understand why she had done what she did, even though I knew no explanation would ever make it okay. Eventually, I texted her back, agreeing to meet. We decided on neutral ground, Starbucks of all places. It felt strange meeting her at a coffee shop, like we were just two acquaintances catching up, but maybe that was fitting. After all, we were strangers now in so many ways. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a small table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked different, thinner, more fragile. I wasn't sure if it was the guilt weighing on her or just the strain of everything that had happened. But seeing her like that, I realized that I didn't know how to feel about her anymore. I wasn't angry, at least not in the way I had been. I wasn't sure if I was sad, either. What I did know was that I felt a distance between us that hadn't been there before, even during the worst of it. She looked up when I sat down, her eyes full of uncertainty. We didn't speak right away. There was an awkwardness between us that felt almost insurmountable, like we didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. "I'm glad you came," Emily said after a few moments of silence, her voice tentative. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, folding my hands on the table. "But I figured we need to talk eventually." She nodded, staring down at her cup as if it held all the answers. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About us. About everything that happened. I know I can't undo what I did, and I don't expect you to just forgive me. But I want to try to make things right." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to hear from her. An apology? A promise that it would never happen again? None of that could erase the hurt or fix the damage that had already been done. "I don't know if things can ever be right again," I said finally, my voice steady but quiet. "I've been thinking too, and I don't know if I can get past this." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I understand that," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry, Jim. I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking clearly. I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was genuinely remorseful and that maybe, somehow, we could find a way to move forward. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the betrayal. The image of her with Tyler was burned into my mind, and I didn't know if it would ever go away. "I don't know, Emily," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I don't know if an apology is enough. You broke my trust. And trust, that's everything. Without it, what do we even have?" She didn't have an answer to that, and neither did I. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think there's any chance we could go to therapy? Maybe that could help." I hadn't even considered therapy. The idea of sitting in a room with a stranger, airing out all of our dirty laundry, wasn't exactly appealing. But at the same time, I knew that if there was any hope of saving our marriage, we couldn't do it on our own. "I don't know," I said slowly, not committing to anything. "Maybe, but it's not going to fix everything." "I know," she said, nodding quickly. "I know it won't, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I just want a chance to try." For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who was strong and determined, who didn't give up easily. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance we could find our way back to each other. But even as that thought crossed my mind, the doubt lingered. Could I ever really trust her again? Could I ever really move on from what she had done? Only time would tell. The weeks following that awkward conversation at Starbucks were filled with a strange mixture of cautious hope and lingering bitterness. Emily and I agreed to try therapy, even though neither of us knew what it would really accomplish. It felt like the last thing we hadn't tried, a Hail Mary, something to throw at the problem in the hopes that it might magically solve everything. Our therapist, Dr. Palmer, was a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair and a voice that could both comfort and unsettle you. I didn't know what I expected from therapy, but I certainly didn't anticipate just how uncomfortable it would be. Every session felt like peeling off a layer of skin, exposing things I didn't want to talk about, feelings I had buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they weren't there. We talked about the affair, of course. Dr. Palmer didn't waste any time digging into that wound. She wanted to know every detail, how it started, why it happened, what Emily had been feeling at the time. Hearing Emily describe it was like reopening a scar that hadn't fully healed. Every word she said was a reminder of the betrayal, of how she had chosen someone else over me. But Dr. Palmer insisted that we needed to confront it head-on, to drag it out into the open if we had any hope of moving past it. I had to admit, the sessions forced me to think about things differently. For one, I hadn't really thought about why Emily had cheated. In my mind, it was always just about the betrayal, the act of it. But Dr. Palmer made us go deeper. She asked Emily why she had felt disconnected. What had been missing in our relationship that made her turn to someone else? At first, I bristled at the suggestion that I was somehow responsible. But as the sessions went on, I started to see that it wasn't as black and white as I thought. Emily wasn't the villain in this story, at least not entirely. Yes, she had cheated, and that was something I would never excuse. But our marriage had been crumbling long before Tyler came into the picture. We had stopped communicating, stopped making time for each other. We had let the weight of everyday life grind us down until there was nothing left but resentment and silence. In some ways, the affair was a symptom, not the cause. Not that it made anything easier. Even with that understanding, I still couldn't shake the anger. Every time Emily reached out to touch me, I felt myself tense up, my mind flashing back to images of her with someone else. Trust, as I had told her that day in the coffee shop, was everything. And rebuilding it was going to be a long, hard process, if it was even possible at all. The therapy sessions helped in some ways, though. They gave us a space to talk, to say things that had been buried under years of avoidance. We talked about the distance that had grown between us, the unspoken frustrations, the disappointments neither of us had ever voiced. It was painful, but it was also necessary. If we were going to move forward, we had to confront everything that had brought us to this point. But outside of therapy, life continued to be a minefield. I was still struggling with the reality of our situation, and Emily was trying to navigate the delicate line between giving me space and wanting to fix things. Some days were better than others. There were moments when I could see glimpses of the life we used to have, the comfortable, easy companionship we once shared. But more often than not, the weight of what had happened would crash down on me, and I'd find myself pulling away, unable to shake the images in my head. One afternoon, a few months into therapy, I came home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of old photo albums spread out in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed and tired. She had been crying. I hadn't seen her like that in a while. Most of the time, she tried to keep it together, to be strong for both of us. But today, she looked vulnerable, like she was barely holding on. "I found these in the closet," she said, gesturing to the albums. "I thought maybe we could go through them together. Remember some of the good times." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to walk out of the room and avoid another emotional landmine. But the other part of me, the part that still wanted to believe there was something worth saving, nodded. I sat down across from her, and she opened the first album. The pages were filled with photos from our early years together. Our wedding, the honeymoon in California, holidays with family, and the countless little moments that had once felt so special. As we flipped through the pages, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. The people in those photos were so different from the people we had become. Back then, we had been so full of hope, so sure that our love could withstand anything. "I miss this," Emily said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo of us laughing on the beach. "I miss who we used to be." I didn't know how to respond. I missed it too, but the gap between who we were and who we had become felt insurmountable. "Yeah," I said finally. "I miss it too." We sat there in silence for a while, flipping through the pages without saying much. But in that quiet moment, I realized something. I wasn't sure if we could ever go back to being those people, but maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to build something new. Something different, but still worth fighting for. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel quite as lost. Therapy was helping, and while things were far from perfect, there was at least a path forward, one we could try to navigate together. But as the weeks went by, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about fixing what had been broken between us. It was also about figuring out who I was outside of the marriage, outside of the role of husband and provider. I had spent so many years defining myself through my relationship with Emily that I had lost sight of who I was as an individual. So, I started taking steps to reclaim that part of myself. I joined a local running club, something I had always wanted to do but had never made time for. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in years, people who had drifted away as life got busier. I even signed up for a painting class, a hobby I had dabbled in during college but had abandoned once adult life took over. It felt good to rediscover these parts of myself, to do things just for me. And strangely, the more I focused on my own growth, the easier it became to see a future with Emily. A future where we were both stronger individuals, capable of rebuilding a partnership that was based on more than just the past. Emily noticed the change too. She was still struggling with her own guilt and remorse, but she had started to do some work on herself as well. She went back to school part-time, something she had always wanted to do but had put off for years. She started seeing a therapist on her own to deal with the underlying issues that had led her to cheat in the first place. Slowly, we began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the past loomed large, threatening to pull us back into old patterns. But we were trying. For the first time in a long time, we were both trying. A few months after we started therapy, Dr. Palmer suggested we take a trip together. Something to get us out of the routine, away from the stress of everyday life, and give us a chance to reconnect in a different environment. It seemed like a crazy idea at first. A vacation? After everything that had happened? But the more we thought about it, the more it made sense. We needed a break. We needed to step away from the hurt and the anger and try to remember what had brought us together in the first place. So, we booked a trip to the Outer Banks, a place we had visited early in our marriage. It felt symbolic, returning to a place where we had once been happy, in the hopes that we could find some of that happiness again. As we packed our bags and prepared to leave, I felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. This trip could be a turning point, either the beginning of a new chapter or the final nail in the coffin. The drive to the Outer Banks was quiet, but not in the tense way it had been in recent months. This was a more comfortable silence, the kind that felt like a much-needed break from the whirlwind of emotions we'd been trapped in. The ocean breeze and the salty air greeted us as we crossed the bridge to the island, bringing with it a sense of nostalgia, but also of possibility. I hadn't been back here in years, and the memories that resurfaced as we pulled into the small beach town were surprisingly gentle. It was almost like stepping back in time. The same small seafood restaurants we'd eaten at, the boardwalk where we'd once walked hand in hand, even the surf shop where we'd impulsively bought matching sweatshirts one chilly evening. The area hadn't changed much, and I think that's what we needed, a reminder of something stable, something that felt solid in a time where everything had been shifting beneath our feet. The house we rented was a cozy little cottage, right off the beach. It had weathered shingles, a wraparound porch, and huge windows that let in the light and the sound of crashing waves. As we unpacked our things, I caught Emily standing by the window, staring out at the ocean, lost in thought. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should say something, but instead, I just joined her. We stood there, side by side, neither of us saying a word, but both of us knowing why we were there. That night, we went out for dinner at one of the local seafood joints we used to love. The waitress, a bubbly teenager who couldn't have been more than 16, chatted us up about the menu specials. There was something almost funny about the normalcy of it all. Here we were, a couple with so much baggage, yet the world outside carried on, unaware of the storm we were trying to weather. It felt surreal, sitting across from Emily at a table we had probably sat at a decade ago, before everything got so complicated. As the night wore on, we talked about lighter things, old memories, funny moments from our first trip here, stories from work, even random gossip from back home. It was strange, but nice. For the first time in what felt like ages, the conversation wasn't about us, or the affair, or the mess we were trying to sort through. It was just two people sharing a meal and talking. I realized how much I had missed that, just being around Emily without the heavy cloud of everything hanging over us. By the time we walked back to the cottage, hand in hand, I could feel a shift. It wasn't some magical fix. It wasn't as though everything was suddenly okay. But it felt like a step. A small one, sure, but a step in the right direction. We sat on the porch that night, listening to the ocean, the stars bright above us. The kind of scene you'd see on the cover of a romance novel. Yet it didn't feel forced or like we were pretending to be something we weren't. It just felt peaceful. Over the next few days, we settled into a quiet routine. Long walks on the beach, exploring the local shops, lazy afternoons reading on the porch. We talked a lot, but not about the affair. We both knew we needed a break from that, and without saying it aloud, we seemed to agree that this trip was about rebuilding, not rehashing. We let ourselves enjoy each other's company, reconnecting in small ways, learning how to just be together again. But, of course, reality had a way of creeping back in. It was our third night there. We had just gotten back from another evening stroll along the shore, our feet still sandy, when Emily broke the silence. We were sitting in the living room, the sound of the ocean faint in the background. When she turned to me, her face serious in a way that made my stomach knot. "Adam," she started, her voice quiet but steady. "I need to tell you something." My heart immediately raced. It was the tone she used when she had something important to say, and given everything we'd been through, I couldn't help but brace for the worst. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she continued, her eyes fixed on her hands. "About everything. About us. About what I did." I stayed quiet, letting her talk. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I knew I needed to hear her out. "I've told you how sorry I am, and I know that doesn't fix anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But what I don't think I've really said is, I get it. I understand if you can't ever fully trust me again. If this is something that we can't move past." I felt my chest tighten. This was the conversation I'd been dreading. The one where we acknowledged that maybe we couldn't put the pieces back together, no matter how much we wanted to. "I want to fight for us," she said, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "I love you, and I want to fix this. But I don't want you to feel like you're stuck, like you're forcing yourself to stay just because it's the easier option. You deserve to be happy, Adam, even if that means it's not with me." Her words hit me like a freight train. This was the part of infidelity no one really talks about. The point where both people have to face the possibility that even after all the apologies and the therapy and the efforts to fix things, it might not be enough. I sat there for a long moment, processing everything she had just said. My mind flashed back to that moment in Starbucks when she had asked if I could ever trust her again, and how I had been so uncertain. Even now, I still didn't know. But what I did know was that I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. "I don't know what the future looks like," I finally said, my voice heavy with emotion. "But I'm not ready to give up on us. Not yet." Emily's eyes widened slightly, like she hadn't expected me to say that. For a moment, she just stared at me, and then slowly, she nodded. She didn't say anything else, but the relief in her expression was palpable. The rest of the night was quiet. We didn't talk much after that conversation, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But something had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding between us now. We weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but we were both still in this fight. We were both still choosing each other, even with all the broken pieces. As the trip wound down, I found myself feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, and I knew it could be easily shattered, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. We drove back home with a little more peace than when we'd left. Life would still be waiting for us with all its complications and challenges, but at least now we had a direction. A path, however uncertain, that we were willing to walk together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something new. Something we could rebuild from the ashes of what had been lost.